Everybody, thank you and welcome. Hi, everybody. My name is Ian Williamson, and I'm with Policy Commons. We are hosting this webinar event today. First off, I wanted to say to everybody, thank you for joining. Today, we have a truly international audience stretching from Australasia all the way through to the Americas. We have over 400 registrants for this. We're not sure how many people are going to be on, but I say that because the timing for some people is a little bit odd, and we are going to be sending out a video recording of this to everybody afterwards and linking it to. So you will be getting a video link to the final product at the end. But also, I wanted to let you know that because if it is interesting to you and you get something from it, please do share it around with your community, your research community, and your associates. So that being said, for Policy Commons and for today, the title is, I Know It's Here Somewhere, Exposing Grey Literature for the Greater Good, essentially shining a light on organizations that publish their own research and the needs of policymakers and practitioners. I'm not going to go too fully into the description itself because I think the conversation between Mr. Green and Dr. Lawrence is just going to kind of move forward. But in brief, Dr. Lawrence and Toby will speak and help us learn more about her work with a part of the scholarly communication spectrum that is rarely discussed. Research organizations beyond academia and the needs of the policymakers in that regard. So Dr. Lawrence is a research fellow at RMIT University in Melbourne, Australia, and is a researcher and librarian specializing in open knowledge systems, research communications, and publishing in the public interest. Her interests include open access and alternative publishing systems, Wikipedia and the Wikimedia ecosystem, public knowledge infrastructure, knowledge commons, and libraries. Previously, she was the Director of Analysis and Policy. She was Director of Analysis and Policy Observatory, or APO, an award-winning public policy digital library, and has worked with many partners. Sorry, I'm just pulling my notes down. And has worked with many partner organizations in education and public policy. She also developed online platforms for the ARC Center of Excellence for Creative Industries and Innovation and the CRC for Low Carbon Living. Toby is the publisher of Policy Commons and Coherent Digital, and he was also the previous head of publishing for the OECD and the OECD iLibrary. And without any further ado, I am going to hand it over to you, Toby. And I'm going to put on mute. And on.
Okay. Well, thanks for the getting the feedback. Thanks very much for the introduction, Ian and Amanda. Welcome. Great to see you again. And we've never actually met in person, which we ought to fix one day. But it's great to be in touch with you again and talking about, I think, our favorite subject, grey literature and everything that goes around that. What I'd like to sort of start with is you, in one of your recent papers, you use a wonderful term, shadow publishing, which is, I thought, was a much nicer way of describing the world that we're talking about, the grey lit publishing world. What do you mean by shadow publishing and shadow publishers?
I'll unmute myself. What I was trying to allude to is the way in which there's a lot of publishing that occurs in parallel to the formal and commercial publishing systems, both the formal academic publishing and commercial systems. And it's shadow because even though it's actually incredibly abundant and hundreds of thousands of organizations around the world are producing their own material, it's often not seen. Sometimes it feels to me like it's the ghost that's there in the air, or it's like, like the old thing about fish wouldn't know what water is. It's the air that people in public policy breathe, and yet nobody talks about it. So it feels like it's in the shadows, but it's also shadow in that it's running parallel to what we kind of see more broadly.
So why do you think, in a sense, it remains, if it's sort of there, it's sort of like ubiquitous, and as you mentioned, hundreds of thousands. I mean, I'm not sure if there are that many orgs out there doing it, but maybe there are. Why is it in the shadows? Why isn't it more front and center, particularly in a world where open content is gathering interest, because most of this content is indeed open?
Yeah, I've thought about this a fair bit, and I think one issue is that academia is one of the key players in the academic and in the research publishing space. And somebody told me that when they, in the 80s in Australia, when they were looking at ways of evaluating research publishing, maybe it was the 90s, they considered including the report literature, and it was just too hard to actually kind of fit it into standard metric systems and collecting systems. And so it became one of those things that, if it's not measured, it doesn't count. And that has continued, to this day, really. It is still very difficult. It's very diverse. So academia has come to focus more and more on the formal channels and measuring those formal channels. A lot of academics don't really engage in this kind of space. So if you're in more, medical and science areas, you may not be publishing anything that looks like grey literature, although, in computer science, conference papers are very important, and many academics publish conference papers, which is sort of have got a foot in both camps, sometimes managed very formally and sometimes more informally. So academia, which is this major player, has sort of turned its back to some extent. But if you're an academic involved in any kind of social or public policy area, or even environmental science and a lot of areas, public health, you are engaged in this kind of publishing because many of your organizational partners, want this sort of material, want reports, want briefings. You're trying to influence public policy issues, so you are engaged in that. So there's only a certain, part of the academic system that is focused on this area, but they don't get rewarded for it. So you don't tend to get rewarded for publishing a report, even if it's, very highly, has a lot of impact. So that's been a big problem. And then outside of academia, so academia is the one area that really cares and wants to measure publishing. Other parts of the sector, think tanks or, NGOs, government departments, they're not so interested in actually measuring and monitoring what they do in that same way, in that reward-based way. And so it's a lot more focused on getting the latest report out, getting it into the hands of policymakers, and moving on. And so, actually sort of having to, keep that backlog, keep that the sort of the metrics around it. And also you've got disparate sectors, the government sector, the NGO and civil society sector, the commercial consultancies, and kind of academic researchers. There's no kind of coherent way that brings them together. They tend to come together around policy issues or public interest issues. And so it's quite difficult to have a general community of interest in this material.
Okay, so going back to the rewards, so the reward system in academia, here you're really referring to the reward system around individuals in terms of their own career paths. Is that what you mean by the reward system?
Yes. Yes, largely. So academics are awarded or measured by academic journals and books. And in Australia, we use the term non-traditional research outputs, and that's, relatively recent term to cover both, kind of creative outputs, but also all the reports. So that's one step towards actually kind of recognizing the report literature. But even that tends to still be, fairly narrow. It needs to be quite a major report that's, been published or been commissioned by another organisation. So that's a step towards measuring and then against an academic's research output. So what you get is a lot of research centres within academia operating like, kind of quasi think tanks or NGOs, because they're much more, they're funded to have more impact, and they may be, producing a lot more kind of report material that rather than individual academics in departments, because there's just
so the impact that they're interested in is more at the organizational level rather than at the individual level in terms of
Yes, in the centre level and also the topic level. If you're a research centre, my current centre is a research centre for automated decision making and society. We've been heavily involved in submissions around responsible AI and many related areas, and that's trying to engage in a topic that is currently being legislated. That things are happening right now, and so many organisations, including research centres, but other organisations, the imperative is to engage with the topic that's currently happening in the world. Decisions are being made about this issue in the world right now, which is really important to recognise, because if you think about the commercial imperative, you are ultimately aiming to sell the cover price of the book or the magazine or so on, and make money that way. If what you want to do is change legislation, who cares about the cover price? Like you will find the money to do the research, to produce the publication and try and get it into the hands of the people who are going to be making decisions. And that it's not just a linear, trying to get to the politician. It could be bringing together a whole community of actors to agree on your perspective on what should happen about a particular issue. So there's a lot at stake.
Sure, but thinking here about the role of the formal publisher, I've noticed there are some organizations, like the IPCC or like the IAA, who used to publish in a formal way. Their publications will come out with ISBNs on the back and all the rest of it. They now don't. They now have brought that publishing, if you like, in-house. And I'm wondering, do you think this is going to be a trend where with more organizations deciding that actually we want to take control over our publishing and actually do it ourselves?
I think it's been a trend for a very long time, to be honest. So, really from the post-war period, it's been a massive trend of the publishing reports by organizations. There were and just in terms of getting an ISBN, anybody can get an ISBN. So having an ISBN doesn't mean that you've actually gone via a formal publisher. You just go buy your ISBN. A lot of people are probably moving to using DOIs as a more useful way of tracking your publication within the internet environment. So the ISBN is still useful, but it is very much kind of from a print world and a library world and a perhaps more formal publishing world. So I think that's one of the confusing aspects of looking at a report and trying to work out, has it been formally published, or not? There's so many sort of confusing aspects to this, in that you can have an organisation, say like the CSIRO in Australia, that has a formal publishing arm, and it's sort of its own kind of publishing business, but it also produces all sorts of reports. The World Health Organization has a number of academic journals that are published via academic publishers, but it also produces thousands of reports directly. So some big players will have a foot in multiple aspects of the publishing industry. So doing things informally in-house because it's so flexible, and because if you're going through a commercial publisher, then you need to have some sort of the publisher needs to get some sort of commercial benefit, so it needs to be able to sell that report. So, or that publication,
or they could be being paid. I mean, they could be charging like an APC or something. I mean, it could be paid by the organization.
Well, that's true, and it could be paid for being paid for the service, for that expertise, and I think that is something that's kind of missing in this space is more publishers providing kind of that service for organizations to be able to sort of publish a bit more professionally, but the organizations still want to have total control of the final output and not necessarily sell it.
Yeah, absolutely. But now I mean, I keep on hearing, and I often read particularly on websites, mined out for grey literature, and it may not be peer reviewed, or it hasn't been peer reviewed. And I know that on the journal publishing side, they make a big there's a big thing. This content is peer reviewed, therefore it must be it must be reliable. What's your view on this sort of idea that formal publications are peer reviewed and grey literature isn't?
Yeah, that's clearly not the case in its entirety. So it's once again, there's an enormous amount of diversity. So some, if you think about an IPCC report, it is probably the most peer-reviewed report in the world. Well, the most peer-reviewed publication that exists. Yet it is still published by an organization. They produce it themselves and they host it themselves. So yeah, you've got that at one end of the spectrum, and then of course there is a lot of material that isn't peer reviewed. There's a whole lot of different types of peer review within that. So I did a little kind of summary of it a few years ago, hoping it might get picked up. But, a lot of organizations might have an expert board or group that is advising, that's reviewing. Most government documents will go through, quite extensive kind of internal review. Some organizations, that are really in the knowledge broking kind of space, say in public health and other areas, they may have a formal review process. I know one organization that would it was looking at sort of disability products. They would have an academic reviewer, a practitioner, and an industry reviewer for a 2-page summary of the current research in an area. So some groups are doing really sophisticated and innovative types of reviewing for their material. And then you might just get the in-house kind of copy editing level of review. And then, of course, we are looking at, the internet, where anybody can publish anything online. So there is going to be a lot of material that isn't peer reviewed. So we can't say it's all peer reviewed, but we certainly wouldn't say that it's not, that there is a spectrum and a range of peer review in there. And I mean, one problem we have with this material is there's no systematic way of indicating peer review. A lot of publications that may have gone through peer review won't say anything on their publication. They won't say even, an expert board, reviewed this. And so, getting more information on the documents about what that process was, that, there has been some peer review, and what that looks like would be incredibly helpful, because you just don't know with a lot of documents, and the evaluation of a report or a grey literature is the really hard part for users.
Sure, yeah. I mean, I must say I've noticed that there are more and more reports now do seem to have some sort of statement at the front, and it is, as you mentioned with the IPCC, sometimes it is extraordinary what they're describing in terms of their review process. I mean, it's incredibly thorough, and so but you're right, to have some sort of way of indicating, I think would be really cool. But how on earth you do that, I'm not quite sure at scale. But that's really interesting. Now, in terms of sort of this content sitting in the shadows, if it's all online, why can't Google find it? Why is it still sitting in the shadows rather than it being sort of easily accessible?
Well, you can find quite a lot of stuff with Google. So, and that Google is the first choice of pretty much everybody. Sometimes Google Scholar, but way less use of Google Scholar than Google itself. So, let's face it, we're all using Google. Google is very good if you know what you're looking for, and can be good for, so if you're looking for a specific report, specific organization, it can be very useful. Might give you a initial kind of idea of what's going on. Very, very limited, obviously, no facets in there. So, it's very hard to kind of see, who are the authors that see, and what are the organizations. It would be amazing if Google could do some facets. That would be incredibly helpful. Microsoft Academic was quite useful for that, but that's no longer. So Google will get you a certain way, but of course it gives you an incredible amount of noise. So if you're looking for something on, climate change adaptation, there's going to be so many different types of publications, of news releases, of so much different material, and it's almost impossible to do kind of systematic sort of searching using Google. Like how do you drill down into issues that are more detailed? How do you find out what's, who are the different players that are working in a particular area? From my research, a lot of people sort of know the organizations that they want to work with, or that they trust. So they'll go to those organizations themselves and have a look at them directly. Say the WHO, what's the WHO done on this particular issue? Yeah, so the problem is that there are, I mean, you were saying earlier you don't think there's hundreds of thousands, but in Australia alone, there's at least 25,000 consultancies. They're probably not all publishing a report, regularly or at all, but a fair portion. So that's just consulting companies. You think of how many universities there are in the world, how many research centers. The number of think tanks, the number of NGOs has just exploded. The number of government departments and agencies. Once you sort of put it together, it is a huge amount of material that is out there.
What would be your guess? I think it's going to be a very difficult question. What would be your guess? How much research is captured in journals as a percentage of all the research that's done in the world?
Oh, God, it would just. I would just be making something up, really. But yeah, there are, it's.
Do you imagine it might be half?
It could be just half.
Yeah.
It would be fascinating to be able to estimate it. Yeah.
Because I mean, from what you're describing, and you mentioned 25,000. Consultancies in Australia, sort of times that up right around the world. That's an awful lot of research that's going on that's not being captured.
And if you think, so one way of thinking about it is, the research and development revenue and expenditure. So the OECD measures that. Most countries measure that. The Australian Bureau of Statistics, and that measures across business, education, the not-for-profit sector, and government. So it's already recognising that all four of those sectors are investing and have an expenditure on research and development. Academia is not the largest of those. Business is the largest. A lot of that material, a lot of that research and development, only a portion of that is going to manifest into a publication, whether journal or a report. But it just sort of gives you an indication that, firstly, academic research is not the largest component of the research and development sector, and business, government, civil society are the other three. So it's really quite enormous. And really only academia has the imperative to publish in academic journals. The others, they don't have a requirement to do it. Many do, because they want to. You've got a lot of scientists might be based in a research company who also want to have a foot in academic research, want to get that sort of verification. But in my research, interviewing people in many of those companies, they would like to be publishing academic journals, but it's something they would have to do on the side. There's no imperative. There's no reward. It's just a kind of nice to have if you find the time.
So what implications does this have for collection development in libraries that aspire to collect all the research in their area? How do they collect the stuff from the shadow publishers? Yeah,
it's really difficult. It's really time consuming. And, the fact is most libraries don't collect this material. So that's why we have a problem with sort of finding it is, going beyond Google, you do need a good collections to be able to kind of drill down and find everything, or as much as possible, in a systematic way. Sorry, I've lost the thread of the question.
It was just on collection development. I mean,
right, yes.
And of course the other thing that the informal publishing has, because without the DOI and so on, you end up with link rot. So there's the dual problem of finding it and keeping it. Have you got any thoughts on that?
So that is a major issue. Just back to the collecting. A lot of libraries now would be relying on publishers and would be relying on just sort of bringing in published collections, and so they may not even have much of a cataloging staff, because a lot of this material you have to actually catalog. That's what we were doing at APO, or that they still are, is actually doing the original catalogue record for documents that may just be sitting on a website somewhere with no metadata of any kind. So it's with those sorts of materials, you can have really fabulous material. You literally got to analyze the document to get the details out. I know, Policy Commons has been doing great work with sort of being able to extract that metadata out of the PDFs, but it's not a simple exercise, and most libraries don't have the budget for it. Some special libraries will do that. If you're sort of working in a specialist area, but even they often, don't have the budget to do that anymore. Link rot. So it is a major issue. You can't always collect everything because of copyright. So many organizations, because they're not professional publishers, they don't actually really understand about copyright. They don't understand, there's different copyright laws around the world, but in Australia, if you do not put a copyright statement on your publication, it is all rights reserved, which means that most libraries and digital libraries can't actually collect the full text and make it available. And that may not be the intention of the organisation, but they've got a communications person who's done a beautiful job of, creating a really lovely looking document that could be missing a lot of key bibliographic and information that, the online system needs for the flow of information. I often think about it as the plumbing of we have an information flows, and it works way better if standards are used, but they're just often missing because of that lack of professionalism. And again, there's with the link rot, you get organizations that do a website update, or I've heard of organizations where just the marketing people don't think some of the research is very sexy, and they don't really want it on the website. And, it gets put up and then taken down. Government departments and agencies, it can be really terrible at this. So we kind of have a historical legacy where there's the assumption that the archives will collect all this material, which they often will, but that can be 7 years later. Meanwhile, the departments, put up their report and then taken it down, and even really substantial reports. The Wayback Machine and the Internet Archive has been, has been really critical in this space. Saying Wikipedia, it's done a systematic harvesting of all the links, so that because Wikipedia was getting a lot of link rot over time. It's like it's like white ants going through all our documents. You can be looking at a report and think, oh, that's a fabulous reference they've got there, and you will not be able to find it any longer. So our whole kind of academic system is based on being able to verify the information that somebody's given you through their citations. And link rot is just white anting that whole process. So it is a big issue that that needs action at various levels, from the way in which organizations themselves manage their material to investing in public knowledge systems.
Sure. I mean, it's interesting you mentioned the communications. Working at the OECD, I was in the communications department, and it was sort of like oil and water. I would be talking about all the publishing type of things, and my communications colleagues would be giving me funny looks because they didn't understand what I was talking about. And you're right, they wanted to delete older material. How can that possibly be relevant? And I went to a conference of communication sort of folk from the NGO think tanky sort of world in Brussels once. And I went around talking to everyone there and realized that their knowledge of the publisher library world was zero. They'd never heard of DOIs. They'd never heard, and the whole idea that you keep things for posterity. And for me, the problem is it's not a skills problem. It's a knowledge problem. They just don't. No one's trained them in the fact that this is a need. And it's I think it's certainly the smaller NGOs that we've been working with and I've been talking to. I'm only talking to communications people and webmasters, and they just don't understand the language that we use. So it's a big problem, and I don't know quite how one begins to fix that through training, because there's an awful lot of people out there to train. Moving on to the audience, because I know you've done a lot of
metadata is not a sexy word, Toby.
It's not. No, it's not. It's definitely not a sexy word. And things like preservation and all that sort of stuff. No, it doesn't get people excited. But what does get people excited is impact and audience. And I know you've done quite a lot of work looking at how policy folk actually use content, because I mean, it's, again, going back to my experience at the OECD, where obviously the OECD's prime audience was, let's get in front of policymakers. And then you talk to the departments about, okay, well, how are you going to do that? And they go, well, we put it on our website. And you go, yeah, and there was a real lack of understanding and knowledge about how policy folk actually get content, and more to the point, use content. And I know you've done research in that area, so we'd love to hear the insights on how policymakers actually find and use content.
Yeah, and there's a real push and pull aspect to that. So there's the producers pushing their content into various areas. So publishing online is necessary but not sufficient to enable the people to use your research. How that is published. So what my research found was just the diversity of materials that people are using. So reports, but reports can come in various forms. It can be project reports, research reports, technical reports, evaluations. There's a whole many different types of reports that you might be putting out. Executive summaries, the 2-pager kind of version of your 50-page report, discussion papers and policy briefs. Discussion papers can be really useful for sort of putting out ideas into the ether and then trying to generate a bit more interest. In submissions are really important. So when a government department actually calls for material, that's an incredible opportunity to sort of engage, and a lot of people don't really sort of understand how that submission process works and how important it is. There's also a lot of work to sort of keep up and follow with submissions. Data, there's so much of interest in data now, and I think underappreciation. What I've found was actually, the NGOs were the most interested in getting access to data. So, and there's lots of ways in which you can think about, putting your data out there as an interactive visualization, doing all that sort of thing. Actually getting legislation, and also just, it's not as if the books and the journals and the conference papers aren't also still really valuable. But what you see with the sophisticated NGOs and the think tanks is it will be a campaign. So you get your research, you get your report. That research and that report writing in itself can be really useful for shoring up your contacts and getting people interested in an issue. If you're going around talking to people about superannuation and changing the level, then you've already kind of in interviewing people, you've already sort of got them to take a position. And then, say you write your superannuation report, you've got your executive summary there, you then do your public event. You might do public events with other organisations, try and get interviews, go to conferences where people are going to be, present that material. More sophisticated people are doing documentaries, or doing podcast interviews, getting interviewed on other sort of programs, etc. Social media, of course, blog posts, LinkedIn posts. You do need those. It's where those comms and marketing people really come into their own. But it does need the backing of the substantial sort of research report and findings that you're trying to then get in there. So working with coalitions of networks is really useful. So that's all the kind of push side. And what I think often gets forgotten is the pull, that people working in, the same people who are sort of pushing, well, apart from the comms and marketing people, but the researcher in an NGO who's trying to push material out there and produce a report is also looking for the material to put into that report. So they are both the producer and the user, and And so they have a lot of expertise as well, and they are looking for not just, a 2-page summary. Sometimes they want a 2-page summary, but sometimes they want really in-depth material. They want historical material. They want material around particular topics. So topic is absolutely essential. Sorry.
So I was just to say, but what tools do they use to pull? Because I mean, we talked a bit earlier about Google and its shortcomings. Where else do they go to pull content?
Yeah, so Google, I mean, some people use Google Scholar. Some of the databases do have some report literature, so some will use, EBSCO and Scopus and those sorts of systems if they have it, but it'll be limited. Policy Commons is, I'm sure, being increasingly used. APO has been really important in Australia. There are other specialist databases. So BASE is a good one in Germany. It's quite extensive, a university-based collection, but that's quite extensive. Some will have, say in the food area, there's the International Federation of Food and Nutrition. I'm sorry, I forgot what. I'll use a better example. In ERIC in the US is a specialist education database. So some people will know about the specialist databases that they can use, and snowballing is often done, so you go from one report, look at the references in that report, and then, flow on from there. So you can see Ian.
Yeah, Ian's, I think.
Hey, guys. Yes, we do have some questions, and I can't believe we've actually got through 14 minutes already. I just wanted to give you guys, just Toby, one more question from you and an answer, and then I want to open it up to Q&A. And then also, everybody who's on, please do use the Q&A section to drop in your questions. We're seeing some commonality of questions in certain regards, but we will distill them and ask the questions back to Dr. Lawrence and Toby. So yeah, 2 more minutes, guys, and then I can start posing questions.
Well, I mean, maybe my last sort of question to you, Amanda, is how successful do you think shadow publishers are in actually finding an audience?
Some more successful than others. So, as you said, some organizations, all they can really do is get the material onto a website. And some academic research centers as well, that's kind of like, well, that's our job done. We got our research grant, we've done our research. They're not in the same business as the think tanks. That's one issue. They're not in the really in the advocacy and persuasion business. They are more on the research side. So for those organizations, if that's the case, all I can suggest is get it into other platforms. The more platforms you've got your document in, like, don't just leave it on your own website. Yes, you might not be able to do an entire, kind of campaign with documentaries and podcasts and all the rest of it. But the more that your document is as not only on your own website, but in other databases where that information flow and, improving discoverability and improving standards, training yourself up, as you said, on the basics of how publishing works, so that at the very least your information will be discoverable, whatever platform somebody is attempting to use. Versus, I think we could learn a lot, especially in academia. We could learn a lot from from some of the very sophisticated campaigns, from perhaps the devil incarnate, the tobacco industry. So it's now called the Tobacco Playbook, the way in which the tobacco industry has used research, has done advocacy, and use very sophisticated communication techniques. We don't really, on the one hand, communications people don't necessarily always understand how the publishing industry works, but in a lot of cases, the research sector doesn't really understand how good comms and marketing works. And we really need to put those two things together.
Yeah.
And actually that kind of, sorry, Toby, I do want to move to the Q&A. And actually that's a perfect segue into a question that did come up and I actually had is, you talk about the marketing side and the research side and then the production side, and never the twain shall meet. It's the old newspaper problem, reporting versus advertising. What do you think are the touch points or the main things that can be described to both sides? Because it is an issue of both the marketing and the research side to bridge that delta and actually start working together. So I'm going to pose that to you, Dr. Launch.
Yeah. I think that push and pull analogy is really useful. So, you want, if we kept in mind that you want people to both be able to pull the material to you. So how is that going to happen? So not just thinking from I'm the producer and I'm going to push it out there. If someone's out in the world, how are they going to find your material? If they're interested in the topic that you are talking about, how will they find that material? And so just putting that hat on gives you a completely different sort of perspective on,
so in other words, flip
the way
the
in
roles
which you
in the
might
process.
produce them. Yeah. And so, whereas, so, and the same for kind of libraries who have been traditionally very kind of passive, like, we will just wait for somebody to come to us. But that's not really enough anymore these days. Libraries and digital libraries can be really active. They can have newsletters, they can be promoting, they can be directly working with the researchers to sort of try and make sure, and the comms people, to help them understand how that pull mechanism will work, but also they can be part of the push. They need to be thinking, how do we help the push? How do we let people know something new has come to our collection? How do we help the comms and the marketing people sort of understand that pull side, but how do they also actually sort of support the push side? So it's kind of simplistic, but if you think about it from both of those angles, you will have to think about the strategies that are going to be required by both sides, I think.
Yeah, exactly. So more communication in that regard. Okay, so Toby, did you want to address that at all?
Well, having so said when I was at OECD, I was sort of in the communications department, but I was the publisher and so on. But I found, even though I was there in the same team, finding it very, very hard to, I couldn't even get the media department to put DOI links in their press releases. It's so hard to actually, connect the two, even though we were colleagues and it wasn't that we didn't like each other, we got on perfectly well, but to try and get them to change their workflows so that they would just do something as basic as put a DOI link in a press release. We seemingly failed to do. But on the other side, if anyone has ever visited the OECD Better Life Index, which was a communication effort, it was built by the publishing team, and that was a great example where, in fact, the communications people and the publishing people and the data people all got together to build something that was really fantastic. So it is possible, but it is very challenging.
Thank you. So one of the other questions that came up was from a lady in Australia, and she asks, and I'm going to change tacks a little bit. She asks that universities are required to comply with retention and disposal requirements from state governments in Australia. So the question is, should the same requirements be placed on NGOs, IGOs, these kind of organizations from a legal standpoint or a policy standpoint, say, no, we need you to preserve this, make it part of your workflow rather than just pop it up on a website, actually have a strategy. So do you think that essentially the question is distilled, Do you think legislation would help in this regard, or would it do more damage at the end of the day?
I think you could certainly start with research that's publicly funded. So at the moment, we have policies and recommendations so from the ARC and the NHMRC, sorry, in Australia, the research councils around open access, but they generally only refer to material that published by academics. So the government is also looking at sort of an open access policies, and there are sort of various policies and requirements for particularly academic research organizations and universities. I would love to see those same requirements for any organization that's been publicly funded. I think it would be difficult. A lot of think tanks have got private money, or charities have got their own sources. I'm not sure about legislating in that case, because you're really dictating how they do their business. And yeah, I think that would be more of a stretch. But certainly anything that's publicly funded, I think we could really look at regulations that require that to be also deposited in some sort of collection system.
Like a national library or something like that.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Toby, your thoughts?
I was just going to comment, because one of the other questions was about legal deposit. I've done some work with the British Library, where in theory, all the grey literature should be being collected by the British Library. They don't have the resources to scrape websites. And on the flip side, if you went to the NGOs and said, hey, did you realize that legally you're supposed to be depositing a copy of everything that you publish? They would go, what's legal deposit? And how would I do that? And even if they started doing it, you could be sure that tomorrow they'd forget, because it would be the right at the bottom of the task. So I think there's a very interesting sort of challenge. I mean, in the print world, it was sort of easier because you could get on a mailing list, and therefore, the list would churn out and the thing would be sent. In a digital world, that's very hard. I mean, going back to the international organizations, in the print era, international organizations sent legal deposit copies to most of their member country libraries, national libraries. And that was sort of easy because there was a mailing list. And now most of the national libraries are struggling because everything's in a repository. I mean, I know you mentioned, Amanda, WHO a couple of times. WHO actually acknowledged that they have a problem here because they no longer print, therefore they don't send, and the libraries can't fetch. So how does a national library now get a copy of WHO's reports? And this is it's a problem.
Yeah, and even in academia, we have these sort of rules about everything is meant to be in some sort of open access, openly accessible within 12 months. Who's checking on that? So even if we did my solution of yes, if you've been publicly funded, you must do X, Y, and Z. It can be quite difficult to follow up. But at least if you're told that your income, your grant is based on you doing X, Y, and Z, it's a step in the right direction. I mean, the less use of ISBNs. ISBN was also the trigger for a lot of legal deposits, and now that many organisations don't use them anymore, don't see the point. That makes it harder. So I agree. Legal deposit is still aspirational.
There we go. But your last question about ISBNs becoming relevant and so on, and that old tracking system and so on, actually segues perfectly into the next question, which we actually have from an administrator at the New South Wales government's open data portal, SEED. And what she is saying, I won't say her name because I'm not sure if she wants me to, but it's a really great question. And she says that we make citation and DOI information available alongside the data. right? So this is the new modern kind of like tracking thing. And essentially she wants to know, how can we encourage people to both use DOIs and to link their research to the data that's associated with it so that we can maintain this through time. So I think if we distill that, it's the DOI is the new, like it's the digital object identifier, it's the permanency. Do you have any thoughts on how we can have these organizations begin to understand the importance of that, get them to start using it, because it's going to make this side of the house and the preservation side so much easier. So.
Yeah, and there can be a bit of confusion, I think, for a lot of people in whether they should be citing a URL or the DOI. Obviously, a DOI is a URL, but it's not always understood in that way. Yeah, having the, you know, how to cite this kind of information can be, you know, is one part of it. Yeah, it goes back to the kind of metadata issue in a way, you know, and the need for all of us to get more training and more understanding of the importance of information flows and how the standards all sort of support those information flows. I don't have a simple answer to you. I do think we have a kind of problem with citations and the way in which they're still very old-fashioned, and how we, you know, are able to sort of get more up-to-date ways of using citations, more up-to-date models. I'm not sure. I feel that, you know, like who controls the citation system? You know, and there's nobody really. So you've kind of got some formal organisations that provide guidelines. You know, the Australian American Psychological Association or something like that. But you know, how we cite data is still emerging, I think. And how we cite grey literature, again, it also, you know, quite difficult, often quite confusing when you've got multiple publishers, you know, how to actually, you know, put that into a citation. So I guess just making sure that information is as clear as possible. And I guess every organisation, if they can possibly, you know, train people, provide information on how to cite, that could be really helpful.
Yeah, I think that
Toby, please.
I mean, my experience, I mean, one of the things I did at OECD was put a DOI on each of the data sets of the OECD in order to try and encourage them. And we even had, you know, you could click a button and you get a citation, so you could put it into your reference management system. I couldn't even get the OECD staff to cite data as if they were citing a journal article. And I think that this goes back to this, you know, when I would challenge them and say, well, look, why can't you cite the data? They go, but it's different. And for them, when they put a table into a publication that they've extracted from a database, for them, they put source : OECD, name of database, and they put it under the table. And the idea for them to make that a clickable link is sort of, but I don't do that. We've never done that. Why would we ever do that? And of course, the worst issue was when I would see, normally in third-party publications, it would go source : OECD, and then you wouldn't even know which data set. And OECD has 350 data sets. I mean, how useful is that for the subsequent user? But it's baked into the whole culture of how stuff is mentioned and how stuff is cited and so on. And I think, you know, again, it comes down to education, to try and have people understand that why today you can cite data just like a journal article, so why don't you? But it's very, very hard to get people to change their habits. It's a huge challenge, and I failed at the OECD. I guess it'll come in time, but I think it's going to be a very, very long time before it becomes a normal standard practice.
Okay, so guys, we're bumping up on the hour. There's one really interesting question I want to put out there, but rather than have it as a discussive answer, just your top 2 things that can be done to address this issue, just off the top of your head. It's like a nice fun finish. So the question is how do we begin to incorporate grey literature into our classrooms and academic classrooms? And graduate classrooms as well, so up to the university and the postgraduate level, and beyond the mention of the information that information is out there. What are 2 things we can do to start training the upcoming generation of researchers that this is where stuff is, and it's so vitally important. So just two ideas off the top of your head. Sorry to put you on the spot, guys.
Talk about a multi-sector publishing industry. It's not just academia, it's not just commercial. So there's multiple sectors involved, and you know, understand why other sectors might be producing material. It's not all about academia. That would be my number one thing. Like think about the system. Bring systems thinking into this, do the boring stuff. Teach about copyright, teach about GOIs, teach about metadata. Yeah.
Yep, fair enough. Toby?
Well, I think building on the whole system, I mean, the thing about academic publishing is that it is an incredibly sophisticated end-to-end system, all the way from, you know, manuscript submission all the way through to publication, to discovery, to preservation. There's a whole system that's been built. And my feeling is that the grey literature needs to be somehow woven into that system. Unless it becomes part of everyone's workflow, and it becomes just as easy to find and cite a piece of grey literature as it is to find and cite a journal article, it's going to be a struggle. So I think that, you know, that to me has to be the goal. The thing is, the producing organization, these shadow publishers, are never going to do it themselves, or very few of them will, because they haven't got the resources. Therefore, someone's going to have to do it on their behalf.
Okay, so it's going to take maybe an external effort to kind of change the way forward. Well, Dr. Lawrence, Toby, yeah,
improve standards.
There we go. Guys, thank you so much. I know it's very early for you, Dr. Lawrence. It's getting a little bit late here, and for everybody in between, we really appreciate you joining. We will be sending a link to this video to you as a registrant. We did have a couple of inquiries. Please, if you have any questions about Policy Commons, or if you have any follow-up questions, please send them to me. My name and everything will be in the email that comes out, and I will make sure they get to the right people, or to you, Dr. Lawrence. And everybody, thank you so very much, and particularly you guys both, thank you for a wonderful conversation. The hour flew by. And with that, I will say we are going to sign off. So thank you all again.